However, he was executed in 1936 for the homicide of Elegance Bud. Chronic executioner Albert Fish asserted he killed 100 casualties and had youngsters in each state. By November 1934, 10-year-old Elegance Bud had been absent for a considerable length of time. There had been no encouraging pieces of information or improvements with respect to her vanishing from her Manhattan home. That is, until her mom Delia Flanagan Budd got an unknown letter. "Dear Mrs. Budd," it read. "On Sunday, June 3, 1928, I approached you at 406 W. 15 St. brought you pot cheddar, strawberries. We ate. Elegance sat in my lap and kissed me. I decided to eat her." The odd, meandering, aimlessly letter that Mrs. Budd got on that chilly November evening started with the story of a deckhand taste for human tissue and finished with a nerve-wracking depiction of Mrs. Budd's girl being killed and cooked in the broiler. Albeit the composed admission was unsigned and anonymous, it had been sent by the savage chronic executioner Albert Fish. How his extravagant frenzy and dangerous bloodlust became, in any case, is a story as grim and unfathomable as the passing of Beauty Budd itself. This is the frightful story of Albert Fish, the off-the-wall hunter who tormented and killed no less than 3 kids in 1920s New York, and may have killed handfuls more. Brought into the world on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish, Hamilton Howard Albert Fish had many names: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Dim Man. Little, calm, and honest, he had a face that mixed in with the group and a confidential life that would have scared even the most solidified crooks. As a youngster, Fish was tormented by dysfunctional behavior, just like some of his relatives. Not exclusively was his sibling in a refuge, yet his uncle had been determined to have lunacy, while his mom regularly experienced visual fantasies. His dad was 75 years of age at the hour of Fish's introduction to the world and kicked the bucket when Albert was only 5 years of age. His bereft mother didn't have the assets to really focus on Albert and his 3 kin alone and left them with a state shelter. It was there that he considered an enthusiasm for torment. The overseers at the halfway house consistently beat the kids and, surprisingly, sporadically urged the youngsters to hurt one another. Be that as it may, while different youngsters lived in anxiety toward agonizing disciplines, Fish delighted in them. "I was there until I was almost 9, and that is where I got everything rolling incorrectly," Fish later reviewed. "We were unmercifully whipped. I saw young men doing numerous things they shouldn't have done." He came to appreciate and connect the aggravation with joy, which would later saturate sexual delight. At the point when his mom turned out to be intellectually steady and monetarily sufficiently independent to bring him back home in 1880, she eliminated him from the halfway house. Be that as it may, the harm had proactively been finished. Fish kept on managing his own beatings as well as started an undesirable relationship with a message kid in 1882. The kid acquainted him with the sexual acts of urolagnia and coprophagia, the utilization of human waste. In the long run, his sadomasochistic propensities drove him to a fixation on sexual self-mutilation. He would routinely install needles into his crotch and mid-region and beat himself with a nail-studded paddle. Furthermore, in 1890, following a 20-year-old Fish moved to New York City, his violations against kids started. Fish turned out to be progressively inquisitive about the agony of others and burned through no time subsequent to moving to New York City to find out more. He began undermining himself and attacking young men, whom he'd bait from their homes to assault and torment them. A nail-studded paddle was his #1 weapon. Surprisingly, in 1898 Fish wedded a lady his mom had acquainted him with and fathered 6 kids with her. While he never brutally manhandled his own, Fish kept assaulting and tormenting different kids all through their young life. In 1910, while filling in as a house painter in Delaware, Fish met Thomas Kedden. Fish and Kedden started a sadomasochistic relationship, however it is obscure the amount of it Kedden really assented to. In later depictions of the undertaking, Fish would imply that Kedden was maybe mentally handicapped, however arranging truth from fiction in Fish's tales was generally troublesome. Just a short time after their underlying gathering, Fish tricked Kedden to a neglected farmhouse under the misrepresentation of a meeting. At the point when Kedden showed up, nonetheless, he thought of himself as locked inside. For a very long time, Fish tormented Kedden. The sprouting executioner disfigured the other man's body and removed a portion of his penis. Then, as unexpectedly as he had shown up, Fish vanished, leaving Kedden with a $10 note for his difficulty. "I will always remember his shout, or the look he gave me," Fish later reviewed. By 1917, Fish was experiencing issues disguising the side effects of serious psychological instability, driving his significant other to leave him for another man. Fish's self-hurt developed from there on, from squeezing an ever-increasing number of needles into his crotch to stuffing fleece shrouded in lighter liquid into his rear end and setting it ablaze. He started having hearable pipe dreams, too. At a certain point, he enveloped himself by a floor covering on the directions of John the Messenger. Fish started showing his own youngsters abnormal and strangely sadomasochist games, prior to fostering a fixation on barbarianism. As a forerunner to consuming human tissue, he started to eat crude meat, feasts he frequently welcomed his youngsters to share. By 1919, his fixation on torment and savagery had carried him to think about murder. He started to search for weak kids, like mentally handicapped vagrants or destitute dark youngsters, adolescents that he accepted wouldn't be missed. He would guarantee at his preliminary and in later works that God was addressing him, directing him to torment and consume small kids. He scoured promotions in neighborhood papers put out by families searching for somebody to perform housework, or by young fellows searching for work themselves. It was through one of these promotions that he tracked down youthful Grace Budd. Grace wasn't generally Albert Fish's expected objective, it was her more seasoned sibling that he had focused on. Edward Budd was searching for work on a ranch or in the nation, that is the reason he put out the promotion Fish experienced. Fish initially anticipated recruiting Edward and bringing him out to his ranch-style home to torment him. Hence, under the misleading name Honest Howard, Fish approached the Budd family in their Manhattan home. He professed to have some ranch work upstate that required doing, and he was additionally searching for some assistance around the house. Was Edward intrigued? Edward was lean to take the occupation from the average, dim-confronted man of honor. However, unexpectedly Fish's advantage moved. While Edward was considering his deal, Fish saw a little kid remaining behind her folks, 10-year-old effortlessness. He had another arrangement, and he burned through no time. While talking about his made-up ranch and the fanciful work Edward would embrace, Fish nonchalantly referenced that he was visiting the area to visit his niece and go to her birthday celebration. Might little Beauty want to go along with him? Albert Fish, the honest looking more interesting, persuaded Delia and Albert Budd to allow him to take their girl along to his niece's birthday celebration. Albert Fish took Beauty, wearing her Sunday best, to his home upstate, a similar one he had expected to use as a dungeon for her sibling. As per the letter that Albert Fish shipped off Delia Budd, alongside his admission, he concealed in a higher-up room, stripped, so as not to get blood on his apparel, while Beauty picked wildflowers in the yard. Then he called her inside. At the point when she shouted at seeing him, he snatched her before she could escape. As his abhorrent letter read, first, I stripped her bare. How she kicked, chomp, and scratch. I stifled her to death, then cut her in little pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her whole body. The letter, which had plainly been planned to cause alarm inside the Budd home, rushed Albert Fish's ruin, The paper he had composed the letter on turned out to be a piece of writing material from the New York private driver's considerate affiliation. Police asked with the organization and found that the paper had been abandoned by a janitor from the organization at a living house he'd been remaining at. At the equivalent living house, a man named Albert Fish was leasing a spot. After discovering that Fish looked very similar to Honest Howard, Grace Budd's hijacker, the police set up a meeting. Amazingly, Fish admitted in a moment, basically making a fool of himself to uncover the exact subtleties of how he'd graced Budd, as well as many different youngsters. However, eventually, just 3 youngsters, counting effortlessness, could be solidly shown to be his casualties. The Grace Budd murder was by a long shot the most scandalous of Fish's wrongdoings. In any case, 2 different killings were connected to him after his capture. Obviously, they're similarly as horrifying. As indicated by Wrongdoing Historical Center, Albert Fish is accepted to be liable for the homicide of a 4-year-old kid named Billy Gaffney. Billy had vanished while playing with a neighbor in Brooklyn on February 11, 1927. That youngster would later let police know that the boogeyman took Billy. The 3-year-old kid portrayed this boogeyman as a slim, old man with silver hair and a dark mustache. Right away, cops didn't treat the youngster in a serious way. However, when they looked through all around the neighborhood without any pieces of information, they at long last acknowledged he had been stole. He was gone forever. However, after Fish's capture, a motorman on a Brooklyn streetcar line approached to distinguish him as an apprehensive elderly person he saw around the same time Billy had vanished. Evidently, the elderly person was attempting to calm a young man sitting close to him on the streetcar who was weeping for his mom. The man then, at that point, hauled the young man off of the streetcar. Fish owned up to the grabbing and murder of Billy in nauseating subtlety. I took devices, a decent weighty feline of 9 tails. Homemade. Short handle. Slice one of my belts down the middle, cut these parts in 6 strips around 8 inches long. I whipped his uncovered behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, cut his mouth from one ear to another. Gouged out his eyes. He was dead then, at that point. I put the blade in his midsection and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. Albeit nobody was ever ready to find Billy's remaining parts, individuals had the option to find the body of Fish's 3rd affirmed casualty moderately rapidly. In 1924, a little fellow named Francis McDonald disappeared while playing with his sibling in a gathering of companions on Staten Island. His body was found in the forest presently. He had been choked by his own suspenders. Presently before Albert Fish was executed, he admitted to being the person who baited Francis into the forest, later attacking and choking him. He conceded that he was prepared to dissect the kid, however he assumed he heard somebody drawing nearer and ran away from the area. Albert Fish is at long last executed. The preliminary of Albert Fish started on Walk 11, 1935, and exhibited plainly that the man was crazy. True to form, his guard argued blameless by reason of craziness. Fish conceded that his hearable mind flights as voices had advised him to kill kids. Regardless of various specialists associated with the preliminary supporting the craziness request, in any case, the jury viewed Fish adequately normal to establish to be liable. The preliminary required 10 days and finished with a decision that saw Fish executed by electric shock the next year. While anticipating his destiny in jail in Sing Jail in Ossining, New York, Fish was allowed to compose a progression of notes with respect to his violations. These would help journalists covering the frightful case all the more appropriately detail his violations, with a direct record sure to tempt perusers. While it's for the most part accepted he killed any place somewhere in the range of 3 and 9 casualties, Fish himself had one more figure as a top priority. His chilling case that he had a youngster in each state stays unverified. In the meantime, the man's definite memories from jail have never been delivered. Prior to his execution on January 16, 1936, Albert Fish's lawyer Jack Dempsey would not share his client's notes. It just took one look at them to discover that what Fish had depicted was excessively grotesque for public utilization. "I won't ever show it to anybody," he said. "It was the most foul series of vulgarities that I have at any point perused."
Nex adu immortalis, libri spondeo